You do not expect your life to unravel over 2 torn grocery bags in the rain. Emma was exhausted. Her bakery was drowning in debt, and the last bus home was already pulling away, when an elderly woman and a little girl spilled their groceries across the sidewalk. She did not stop because she wanted trouble. She stopped because no one else did. She carried the bags, walked them home, and refused payment. 24 hours later, 4 silent men in dark suits occupied every table in her bakery. Because the woman was Maria Moretti, the child was Sophie, and Emma had unknowingly escorted the family of New York's most feared Mafia boss straight to his front door. Winter rain had swallowed New York by the time Emma Brooks locked the front door of her bakery, turning the street into a ribbon of black pavement, blurred headlights, and trembling reflections beneath the lamps. The wind pushed water beneath her coat and stung her cheeks as she tested the brass handle twice, making sure Brooks' bakery was secure for the night. At 30, Emma had the soft, rounded figure of a woman who had spent years standing beside ovens and tasting recipes she could no longer afford to make in large batches. She was short, broad-hipped, and full-faced, with warm brown skin, dark hazel eyes, and thick chestnut hair twisted into a loose knot that had begun to fall apart after 14 hours of work. Flour still marked one sleeve of her faded wool coat, and exhaustion had settled so deeply into her body that even breathing felt like another task waiting to be completed. The bakery behind her was small, old, and nearly bankrupt, with a broken mixer, an unreliable oven, and a bank notice hidden beneath the register where customers could not see it. Emma had spent the evening calculating how many more weeks she could keep the lights on, and the answer had been cruelly short. She wanted nothing more than to reach her apartment, take off her wet shoes, and sleep before dawn demanded that she begin again. The bus stop stood beneath a narrow metal shelter across the street, already crowded with people avoiding the worst of the rain. Emma crossed carefully, holding her handbag against her chest, and was nearly beneath the shelter when she noticed the little girl. The child was perhaps 6 years old, small for her age, with pale skin, large dark eyes, and long black hair tied with a pink ribbon that had come loose in the rain. She wore an expensive navy coat, though its shoulders were soaked, and clutched a cloth doll so tightly that its painted face was pressed against her chin. Beside her stood an elderly woman, struggling with 2 torn grocery bags. The woman was around 70, elegant despite the weather, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her head, a straight posture, and a face whose fine lines suggested both authority and kindness. She wore polished shoes, unsuited for the storm, and a dark green coat that looked costly but offered little protection against the freezing wind. One bag had split completely, scattering oranges, canned soup, bread, and vegetables across the sidewalk. The second bag was tearing as well, and the elderly woman was trying to gather everything while using her body to shield the child from the rain. People moved around them without stopping. A businessman stepped over an orange while speaking into his phone. A young couple glanced back, then hurried toward an approaching taxi. Emma slowed, watching the old woman's fingers tremble as she tried to reach a can rolling toward the curb. The little girl's lower lip shook, and tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks as she whispered that her doll was getting cold. Emma looked toward the bus shelter, just as the headlights of her bus appeared at the far end of the avenue. If she missed it, she would wait another 20 minutes in the freezing rain. Her knees ached, her stomach was empty, and she had only enough money in her account to cover 3 more days of bakery supplies. She told herself the woman's family would come for her, or someone with more time would help, or a taxi would stop. Emma took 2 steps toward the bus, then heard the elderly woman gasp softly as another bag tore and a glass jar fell against the pavement. It did not break, but the sound made the little girl cry harder. Emma closed her eyes for 1 second, sighed through her nose, and turned around. "Stop trying to pick everything up at once," Emma said as she crouched beside the groceries. Her voice was firm, not unkind, the voice of someone accustomed to solving problems while everyone else panicked. "You hold the bag together. I'll get what rolled away." The elderly woman stared at her in surprise, then obeyed without argument. Emma moved quickly, collecting the oranges before they reached the gutter and wiping rain from the jar with her sleeve. She removed 2 large paper sacks from her handbag, the kind she used for bread orders, and began repacking the food. The little girl watched her with solemn eyes, still hugging the doll, and Emma softened when she noticed the child was shivering. "What's her name?" Emma asked, nodding toward the doll. "Isabella," the girl answered quietly. "And she doesn't like storms." Emma smiled despite herself and told her that Isabella looked brave enough to survive one rainy night. The child's shoulders relaxed slightly, and the elderly woman studied Emma with an expression that seemed too sharp and observant for someone who had just been rescued from a grocery disaster. The bus arrived behind them, opened its doors, and left again without Emma. She watched the red lights disappear through the rain, feeling a brief sting of frustration, then lifted both bags. They were heavier than she expected. "Where is your car?" she asked. The elderly woman hesitated before explaining that she and her granddaughter had gone out without their usual driver because she disliked being followed everywhere. Her answer was vague, but her tone carried the stubborn pride of someone who had spent a lifetime making her own decisions. She introduced herself only as Maria, and the child as Sophie. Maria Moretti did not mention that she was the mother of the most feared man in New York, nor that Sophie's father commanded an organization powerful enough to close streets and empty buildings with a single phone call. To Emma, Maria was simply an old woman who had underestimated the weather, and Sophie was a frightened child who needed to be warm. When Maria said their home was less than a mile away, Emma adjusted the grocery bags against her hips and told them she would walk with them. Maria protested that it was too far in such weather, but Emma replied that she had already missed the bus, so there was no point wasting the sacrifice. The walk took nearly 20 minutes. Rain struck them sideways, collecting in Emma's shoes and running down the back of her neck. Sophie tried to keep pace, but her steps grew slower, and she began coughing into the collar of her coat. Emma stopped beneath the awning of a closed pharmacy and removed the only scarf she owned, a thick grey one her mother had given her years earlier. It was already damp at the ends, but the center was warm from Emma's body. She wrapped it carefully around Sophie's neck and shoulders, tucking the loose fabric beneath the child's coat. Sophie looked up at her with open surprise, as though adults rarely gave her anything without expecting obedience in return. "But you'll be cold," she said. Emma shrugged and told her that bakers were naturally warm because they spent their lives standing beside ovens. It was not true, but Sophie believed it, and Maria's expression changed as she watched Emma straighten the scarf around the child. For the rest of the walk, Maria asked gentle questions about the bakery, and Emma answered honestly that business was difficult, though she avoided saying how close she was to losing everything. She did not notice the black vehicle that passed them twice from a distance, nor the men inside who had been searching the neighborhood for Maria and Sophie. The neighborhood gradually changed as they walked. Small apartment buildings gave way to stone walls, iron gates, and silent townhouses protected by cameras. At the end of a private road stood a vast estate behind black, wrought-iron fencing, its windows glowing gold through the rain. 2 men in dark coats appeared near the gate the moment they saw Maria, their tense expressions shifting to visible relief. Emma assumed they were household staff, though both men moved with the alert posture of trained security. Maria reached into her handbag and drew out several folded bills, insisting that Emma take them for her trouble. Emma's tiredness sharpened into irritation. "I didn't help you for money," she said, pressing Maria's hand closed around the cash. "You were standing in the rain with the child. That's all." Maria tried again, but Emma stepped backward, already turning toward the road. Before leaving, she looked at the soggy paper bags in Maria's arms and smiled. "Next time, remember to bring thicker bags." Sophie waved from behind the gate, the gray scarf still wrapped around her neck, and Emma lifted one hand in farewell before walking away into the rain. She never saw Maria turn to the waiting guards, and quietly order them to find out everything about the woman who had helped them. The next morning, Brooks' bakery smelled of coffee, cinnamon, and the first tray of bread when 4 large men entered within 5 minutes of one another. They were too disciplined to be ordinary customers and too poorly disguised to escape Emma's suspicion. One sat near the window without removing his coat. Another pretended to read the same page of a newspaper for 20 minutes. The third ordered black coffee and never touched it, while the fourth stood near the pastry display as if guarding it from armed attack. All 4 were broad-shouldered, silent, and watchful, with hard faces and the restrained movements of men accustomed to violence. Their presence emptied the bakery faster than a fire alarm. 2 regular customers turned around at the door. A mother pulled her son away from the window, and an office worker abandoned his order after one glance at the men. Emma watched her morning revenue disappear and felt anger rise through the exhaustion she had carried from the night before. She came around the counter, planted both hands on the nearest table, and demanded to know who they were and why they were frightening her customers. The men exchanged glances, but none answered immediately. At last, the tallest one stood. He was in his late 30s, with closely cropped black hair, a strong, angular jaw, and a narrow scar crossing one eyebrow. His name was Leo Romano, Gabriel Moretti's most trusted security chief, a man known among Moretti soldiers for his patience, precision, and absolute loyalty. Leo was usually calm, even under gunfire, but Emma's furious stare made him choose his words carefully. "The elderly woman you helped last night," he said, lowering his voice, "was our employer's mother." Emma's expression remained hard. Leo continued. "The little girl was his daughter." Outside the bakery, a black sedan waited beneath the falling snow, and inside it, Gabriel Moretti watched the entrance with a face carved from grief, discipline, and years of command. He had not sent the men to frighten Emma or repay a debt. He had sent them because someone had seen her walk his mother and daughter home, and in Gabriel's world, kindness could be mistaken for loyalty. Loyalty could be mistaken for intimacy. And anyone believed to be close to Gabriel Moretti could become a target. By 9 o'clock, Brooks' Bakery had become quieter than a church after midnight. The 4 men remained exactly where they had placed themselves, motionless except for the occasional sweep of their eyes toward the windows and front door. Leo Romano stood near the counter, with the controlled posture of a man who understood that one wrong movement could make Emma angrier. Emma, however, had already passed anger and entered something sharper. She watched another regular customer hesitate outside, recognize the hard faces inside, and walk away without entering. That customer usually bought 2 loaves, 4 pastries, and coffee for the entire maintenance crew in the office building across the street. Emma mentally calculated the lost sale before turning back toward Leo. Her round face had gone still. Her hazel eyes narrowed beneath damp strands of chestnut hair, and the flower on her apron only made the fury in her expression seem more startling. "Get out," she said. Leo began to explain, but she raised one hand. "All of you, out of my bakery before there is nothing left here to protect." The men obeyed, though not in the way Emma expected. They left their tables, moved outside, and spread themselves across the street with such deliberate precision that they looked even more suspicious than before. One remained beside the newspaper stand. Another stood near a parked sedan, with his hands folded in front of him. The third took up position beneath the awning of the closed tailor shop, while Leo waited directly across from the bakery door. Emma pressed her forehead briefly against the glass and wondered what kind of wealthy lunatic believed this arrangement would attract customers. Her telephone rang behind the counter before she could march outside and continue the argument. The number was unfamiliar, but something in her chest warned her who it would be. She answered with the kind of silence that forced the caller to speak first. "Miss Brooks," a deep male voice said, calm and measured. "My name is Gabriel Moretti. Emma tightened her grip on the receiver. Gabriel's voice did not sound like the voice of a man accustomed to introducing himself. It carried quiet authority, each word precise and controlled, as though most people stopped talking the moment he began. He explained that he was Sophie's father and Maria's son, then thanked Emma for helping them the night before. Emma looked through the window at the four men frightening pedestrians and told him his gratitude had a strange resemblance to an armed occupation. For the first time, there was the faintest pause on the line. Gabriel Moretti was 41, tall and powerfully built, with dark hair brushed back from a severe forehead, a neatly trimmed beard outlining a strong jaw, and gray eyes that rarely revealed what he was thinking. 3 years earlier, his wife had died suddenly, leaving him with grief he converted into discipline, and a daughter he protected with almost suffocating vigilance. He had learned to trust surveillance, schedules, and armed men, because none of those things could die without warning and leave a 6-year-old asking why her mother was not coming home. With employees, he was cold but fair. With enemies, he was merciless. With his family, fear often disguised itself as control. "I did not send them to repay you," Gabriel said. "I sent them because several people saw you walk my mother and daughter to the estate." "So?" Emma replied. "People also saw me carry groceries. Perhaps I should expect bodyguards every time I buy potatoes." His tone remained even, but the next words removed the humor from the conversation. Gabriel explained that the Moretti estate was watched by rival organizations, private investigators, and men who made their living collecting weaknesses. Emma had not simply helped an elderly woman and a child. She had been seen beside Maria Moretti for nearly a mile, carrying her belongings and entering the private road leading to Gabriel's home. To the wrong observer, that suggested trust. In Gabriel's world, trust implied closeness, and closeness created leverage. Someone who wanted to pressure him might not know Emma was a stranger. They would only know that Maria had allowed her near Sophie, and that the Moretti gates had opened for her. "If anyone decides you matter to me," he said, "they will test that belief before they ask whether it is true." Emma's anger weakened for half a second, replaced by an unwelcome chill. She remembered the black vehicle that had passed during the walk, though she had barely noticed it at the time. She remembered Maria's vague explanation about a driver and the 2 men who had appeared at the gate before anyone called them. Still, fear did not make Emma obedient. It made her defensive. She had spent years keeping the bakery alive without help, borrowing money in her own name, repairing machines with second-hand parts, and smiling at customers while bank notices accumulated beneath the register. She disliked the idea of danger, but she hated even more that a stranger had taken control of her life without asking. "Then tell these people I am no one," she said. "Tell them I helped your family because it was raining, not because I belong to you." "That is not how rumors work," Gabriel answered. "Then perhaps powerful men should stop building worlds where rumors require 4 armed men near a pastry case." The line went silent again. Gabriel was not accustomed to being addressed in that manner, especially by someone who knew his name and understood what it meant. Yet Emma's voice held no performance and no attempt to impress him. She was simply furious, and beneath the fury, he heard something he respected. She would not allow fear to turn her into property. Gabriel finally agreed to remove the men from inside the bakery. Emma believed she had won until the following morning, when a newspaper delivery man appeared outside at 6:30 and remained on the corner long after every paper had been delivered. He was thick-necked, middle-aged, and wore a gray cap pulled low over watchful eyes. When Emma asked why he kept circling the block, he claimed he had misplaced an address. She recognized him as one of the silent men from the previous day. By noon, a taxi had been parked across the street for nearly 3 hours. Its driver, a broad man with a shaved head and a false mustache that had begun peeling at one corner, rejected every passenger who approached. Later,
2 men in utility uniforms opened an electrical box beside the bakery and pretended to examine the same wires until sunset.
The next day, a narrow-faced young guard named Nico Bellini entered disguised as a customer and bought one cinnamon roll every 40 minutes, despite looking increasingly ill from eating them. Nico was only 26, lean and dark-haired, with nervous brown eyes and the earnest loyalty of someone whose older brother had once been saved by Leo during a warehouse ambush. He was brave in dangerous situations, but hopeless at ordinary deception. By his fourth visit, Emma placed a glass of water in front of him and told him that if Gabriel ordered him to eat another pastry, he might need protection from the bakery instead of its enemies. The disguises changed, but the result did not. Customers sensed that something was wrong. The taxi remained too long, the false repairmen watched faces instead of wires, and the supposed newspaper vendor had shoulders too broad for his faded coat. Families stopped lingering. Office workers collected orders quickly and left. By the end of the week, Emma's morning sales had fallen by nearly 40%. She stood alone behind the counter one evening, studying untouched trays of bread that would be stale by morning. The bakery had always been fragile, but now it felt as though Gabriel Moretti's protection was squeezing the last breath from it. Emma removed her apron, lowered herself onto a stool, and covered her face with both hands. For the first time since learning the truth, she allowed herself to feel afraid, not only of Gabriel's enemies, but of losing the bakery before any enemy needed to touch her. The following morning, Leo arrived carrying an envelope. He placed it on the counter and explained that it contained compensation for every dollar of lost revenue, calculated from Emma's records, and increased to cover waste, cancelled orders, and projected customer decline. Emma opened the envelope, saw the amount, and felt humiliation burn hotter than relief. The money was enough to cover several weeks of expenses. It might even delay the bank's next warning. That fact made her angrier. She pushed the envelope back across the counter. Leo did not move. "Mr. Moretti considers the losses his responsibility," he said. "Then Mr. Moretti can repair them by removing his men. He cannot remove the risk. And I cannot run a bakery full of shadows." Leo left the envelope behind, but Emma carried it outside and pressed it into his hand. An hour later, Gabriel called. Their argument began before either offered a greeting. He insisted the money was not charity, but compensation for damage caused by his security measures. Emma told him that paying for destruction did not make the destruction acceptable. He accused her of refusing practical help because of pride. She accused him of solving every problem with money and armed men because he had forgotten how ordinary people lived. Gabriel reminded her that ordinary people were sometimes injured because they underestimated extraordinary danger. Emma replied that she was already being harmed by the protection meant to save her. From that day forward, their calls became a daily battle. Gabriel would report a new precaution, and Emma would reject it. Emma would describe another lost customer, and Gabriel would offer compensation she refused to accept. Sometimes they argued for 2 minutes, sometimes 20, and neither ever ended the call satisfied. Yet, beneath the anger, an uneasy understanding began to form. Gabriel realized Emma's resistance was not foolishness, but a demand to keep control over the life she had built. Emma realized his stubbornness was not gratitude or arrogance alone, but fear sharpened by loss. Neither admitted any of this. For now, Gabriel kept sending guards in increasingly ridiculous disguises. Emma kept discovering them, and the telephone between the Moretti estate and Brooks Bakery rang often enough that Leo began to suspect protecting Emma might be easier than keeping peace between them. The first real snow of winter came quietly, whitening the sidewalks before dawn and softening the hard edges of New York. Emma arrived at Brooks Bakery before sunrise, unlocked the door, and found the familiar cold waiting inside, because the old furnace had failed again during the night. She rubbed her hands together, tied on her apron, and began coaxing the bakery to life, one machine at a time. The aging mixer shook whenever it reached medium speed. The display on the oven flickered unpredictably, and the metal door had to be lifted slightly before it would close. Emma knew every flaw by sound. She knew which grinding noise meant the mixer belt was slipping, which smell meant the oven was overheating, and which corner of the work table had to be struck with her hip to stop it from wobbling. These were not merely machines to her. They were the tired bones of the business she had built, and keeping them alive had become inseparable from keeping herself alive. Outside, Gabriel's protection had grown more discreet, but had not disappeared. A different taxi rotated through the street each morning, and the supposed repairman no longer opened the same electrical box every day. Emma had learned to recognize the guards, despite their improved disguises. She could identify them by the way they scanned reflections in windows, by the stiffness beneath ordinary winter coats, and by how none of them ever turned their backs fully toward the bakery door. She still complained whenever Gabriel called, though their arguments had changed in ways she did not want to examine. His voice no longer startled her, and she had begun to recognize when he was tired by the slight roughness at the end of his sentences. Sometimes he asked whether business had improved before discussing security. Sometimes she told him to mind his own affairs, and then gave him the answer anyway. Neither acknowledged that their daily battles had become a strange form of routine. Late that morning, the bell above the door chimed, and Maria Moretti entered alone. She wore a long charcoal coat over a burgundy dress, with her silver hair pinned in the same elegant style Emma remembered from the rainy night. Maria was small, but carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent decades surrounded by powerful men and had never learned to fear them. Her face held softness around the eyes, but there was steel in the set of her mouth, especially when she believed she had made the correct decision. She removed her gloves slowly, glanced through the front window, and smiled with satisfaction when no bodyguard appeared. "I told them I was visiting a friend," she said. "Technically, I did not lie." Emma stared at her, then looked toward the street, already imagining Gabriel's reaction when he discovered his 70-year-old mother had escaped security again. "You cannot keep doing this," Emma said, though she was already pouring Maria a cup of tea. "Your son has men pretending to fix half the electrical grid because of what happened the last time you wandered off." Maria settled at a table near the oven, warming her hands around the cup. "Gabriel believes danger can be prevented by surrounding it with enough men. And you believe danger disappears if you refuse to look at it?" "No," Maria replied calmly. "I believe life becomes very small when fear is allowed to make every decision." Emma had no immediate answer to that. She returned to the work table and began shaping dough, aware that Maria was watching her with patient attention. For several minutes, only the soft scrape of flour and the ticking oven filled the bakery. Then Maria asked whether Gabriel had apologized for ruining her business. Emma laughed once without humor and said Gabriel did not apologize so much as explain why everyone else was wrong. Maria's eyes brightened with recognition. She said Gabriel had been stubborn since childhood, though his stubbornness had not always been rooted in control. As a boy, he had felt responsible for things no child could influence. When his father became ill, Gabriel believed he should have noticed sooner. When a school friend was injured in a street fight, Gabriel blamed himself for leaving early. Even then, he carried guilt like an obligation, collecting it from every room he entered. Maria's voice softened as she spoke of the woman Gabriel had married. Isabella Moretti had been graceful and warm, with auburn hair, pale green eyes, and the rare ability to make Gabriel laugh in public. She had not feared his world, but she had insisted that their home remain separate from its cruelty. For nearly 10 years, she had been the one person who could make him set down his phone during dinner and leave meetings before midnight. Sophie had inherited her mother's gentleness, along with the same habit of pressing her lips together when trying not to cry. 3 years earlier, Isabella had collapsed unexpectedly after what everyone believed was an ordinary illness. By the time Gabriel reached the hospital, she was unconscious. He had stood beside her bed, holding 6-year-old Sophie's sleeping body against his chest, and promised that no one else in his family would ever be left unprotected. He could not save his wife, Maria said, looking into the steam rising from her tea. So now he tries to save everyone before they have even asked. Emma's hands stopped moving over the dough. Until that moment, she had understood Gabriel only through the consequences of his choices. The guards, the frightened customers, the envelopes of money, the orders delivered as if disagreement were an inconvenience. She had imagined him sitting comfortably in some vast office, using power because power was easier than conversation. Maria's story placed a different man behind the voice on the telephone. Emma pictured Gabriel arriving too late at a hospital, carrying his daughter on his wife slipped beyond his reach. She pictured a promise made in panic and grief, then repeated so often that it hardened into law. The image did not excuse what he had done to her bakery, but it made his fear visible. For the first time, Emma understood that every guard outside her window represented not only control, but also the memory of a woman he had failed to keep. Maria stayed until noon, helping fold paper bags and pretending not to notice when Emma quietly packed bread for her to take home. Before leaving, she touched Emma's hand and asked her not to judge Gabriel solely by the armor he had built after Isabella's death. Emma replied that armor could still injure people standing too close. Maria nodded and said that was precisely why Gabriel needed someone willing to tell him when it had become too heavy. Then she slipped out through the side entrance, leaving Emma alone with the ovens and thoughts she had not invited. That afternoon, Gabriel called to ask whether Maria had been there. Emma lied for exactly 4 seconds before admitting everything. He exhaled slowly, and she expected anger, but he only asked whether his mother had crossed the street carefully. Emma told him Maria had crossed it with the confidence of a queen invading a neighboring country. 2 days later, a bank representative called Emma with unexpected news. The outstanding loan attached to Brooks Bakery had been paid in full by an anonymous third party. Emma stood beside the register, gripping the telephone so tightly her knuckles whitened. She demanded a name, but the representative said the payment had been processed through a private legal office, and all identifying information was confidential. The amount covered not only the overdue installments, but also the remaining principal. Emma's first emotion was relief so intense that her knees nearly gave way. The second was suspicion. She called Gabriel immediately, but he denied knowing anything about the payment with such calm precision that she knew at once he was lying. The following morning, 2 technicians arrived before opening. The older man was broad and grey-haired, with grease embedded permanently beneath his nails, and the patient manner of someone who had repaired commercial kitchens for 3 decades. His younger assistant was thin, red-haired and cheerful, carrying a toolbox nearly as large as his torso. They said a maintenance contract had been purchased in Emma's name and proceeded to dismantle the mixer, replace its failing motor, reinforce the work table, and repair the refrigeration unit beneath the pastry display. Emma tried to stop them until the mixer began running more smoothly than it had in years. Before she could recover from that shock, a delivery truck arrived with a new commercial oven. It was not extravagant, but it was reliable, efficient, and precisely the size required for her cramped kitchen. Emma stood in the center of the bakery while the old oven was removed. She ran one hand over the polished steel of the replacement and felt something inside her chest loosen. She had spent months waking at night, terrified that the next mechanical failure would end everything. Now the debt was gone, the mixer worked, and the oven heated evenly for the first time since she opened the shop. No card had been delivered. No name appeared on the invoices. Yet she could almost hear Gabriel's voice in the silence, insisting that practical problems required practical solutions. Emma was still angry that he had acted without permission, but the anger no longer stood alone. Beneath it was gratitude, tenderness, and the unsettling realization that Gabriel had listened to every complaint she had made, even when she believed he was only waiting to argue. That evening, she baked a small batch of cinnamon bread in the new oven. The loaves rose evenly, their tops turning golden instead of burning at the edges. Emma cut one open and watched steam curl upward, filling the bakery with butter, spice, and the scent of something beginning again. Her telephone rang on the counter. Gabriel's name appeared on the screen, though she had never saved his number. Emma answered and remained quiet for several seconds. When he asked whether the security arrangements had caused any new problems, she looked at the repaired mixer, the shining oven, and the bank statement lying open beside the register. "You are an infuriating man, Gabriel Moretti," she said softly. On the other end of the line, he did not deny it. For the first time since their arguments began, Emma was smiling when she said his name. Dark clouds settled over Manhattan long before sunset, and by late afternoon, the city had fallen beneath another curtain of freezing rain. Brooks Bakery glowed warmly against the grey streets, its windows fogged by the comforting heat of fresh bread and cinnamon. Inside, Emma Brooks moved confidently around her newly repaired kitchen, sliding trays into the new commercial oven, whose steady warmth still felt almost miraculous. Over the past week, she had reluctantly admitted that business was beginning to recover. Some regular customers had returned after realizing the strange men outside no longer lingered so obviously. And although she still argued with Gabriel Moretti nearly every day, those conversations had gradually become less about winning and more about understanding. She still refused to thank him for the anonymous repairs she knew he had arranged, while Gabriel stubbornly continued pretending he knew nothing about them. Neither realized that someone else had been watching every exchange from much farther away. Across the East River, inside an abandoned warehouse overlooking the harbor, another organization had finally reached its conclusion. Their leader, Victor Caruso, was a man in his early 50s, whose once handsome face had been hardened by decades of violence. His black hair had faded into iron gray around the temples, a heavy beard concealed an old knife scar beneath his chin, and his pale blue eyes rarely blinked while he listened. Victor had lost much of his criminal empire after Gabriel Moretti transformed large portions of the Moretti organization into legitimate businesses. Shipping contracts, warehouse leases, and transportation routes that once belonged to Caruso had quietly shifted toward Moretti companies operating within the law. Victor believed Gabriel's greatest weakness had always been impossible to discover, because the man trusted almost no one outside his own family. Yet for weeks, his observers had reported something different. An unknown bakery owner had escorted Gabriel's mother and daughter safely home. Security teams had surrounded her business immediately afterward. Anonymous money had appeared to rescue her failing bakery. To Victor, these events meant only one thing. Whether Gabriel admitted it or not, Emma Brooks mattered. Victor calmly spread photographs across the warehouse table. Each image showed Emma outside her bakery, speaking to Maria, arguing with disguised guards, or unlocking her shop before sunrise. "We do not need to kill her," he said quietly. "We only need Gabriel to believe we can." Around the table, several men nodded. Among them sat Adrian Costa, the youngest member of Victor's organization. Adrian was 32, lean and athletic, with close-cropped blonde hair, sharp green eyes, and a face ordinary enough to disappear into any crowd. Years earlier, he had served briefly in the military before becoming a contract assassin after gambling debts destroyed his life. Unlike many hired killers, Adrian disliked unnecessary cruelty. He preferred precision, patience, and clean exits. Victor selected him precisely because he looked harmless. "You are buying bread," Victor told him. "Nothing more. Wait until security changes shifts. Bring me the woman alive if possible. If not, bring me proof that Gabriel Moretti cannot protect everyone." That same afternoon, Maria Moretti once again decided that security was an inconvenience rather than a necessity. She convinced Sophie that they should surprise Emma with homemade orange marmalade, prepared from the fruit Emma had rescued during the storm weeks earlier. Sophie happily agreed, before anyone inside the estate realized they had disappeared. The 6-year-old wore a cream-colored winter coat and carried the same cloth doll, Isabella, beneath one arm. Maria insisted they would only stay a few minutes. Leo discovered their absence almost immediately and dispatched nearby guards to search the neighborhood, already imagining the expression Gabriel would wear when informed that both his mother and daughter had vanished together. Gabriel himself was finishing a meeting across Midtown when Leo called. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds before Gabriel abandoned the conference room and headed directly toward Brooks' Bakery. Emma looked up from arranging fresh pastries when the familiar bell announced Maria and Sophie. She smiled, despite herself. Sophie ran immediately toward the display case, proudly announcing that Isabella wanted another cinnamon roll. Maria placed the jar of marmalade on the counter and declared that repayment was long overdue. Emma laughed softly and prepared tea, pretending not to notice how Maria avoided mentioning the inevitable lecture Gabriel would deliver later. The atmosphere inside the bakery felt unusually peaceful. Rain tapped gently against the windows, bread cooled upon the racks, and Sophie sat at a corner table drawing pictures with colored pencils Emma kept for neighborhood children. For several precious minutes, the bakery felt less like a business struggling to survive, and more like the home Emma had always dreamed of creating. The piece ended when the front door opened once more. Adrian Costa entered, carrying a folded umbrella and wearing a dark business coat over an ordinary grey sweater. Water dripped quietly from his shoulders as he apologized for arriving so close to closing time. Emma greeted him politely without recognizing him. He appeared tired, courteous, and completely forgettable, exactly as he intended. While pretending to study the pastry shelves, Adrian discreetly checked the street through the corner of the window. Outside, two disguised guards exchanged positions, beginning the routine shift change Leo had carefully scheduled every evening. For less than 30 seconds, the bakery stood protected by fewer eyes than usual. Adrian's fingers slipped calmly beneath his coat. Emma sensed something before she understood it. Years of reading customers had taught her to notice tiny changes in body language. This man's shoulders had become unnaturally still. His breathing slowed instead of quickening. His eyes no longer examined pastries, but measured distances. The tray of croissants warming beside the oven remained in Emma's hands as Adrian suddenly drew a compact pistol fitted with a suppressor. Maria gasped. Sophie froze. Time seemed to narrow into a single, impossible heartbeat. Emma did not think. She reacted. With every ounce of strength developed from lifting heavy baking trays day after day, she hurled the entire metal tray directly toward Adrian's face. The steaming pastries scattered through the air as the scorching metal edge struck his forehead. Adrian cried out instinctively, dropping one knee as burning butter and hot bread exploded across his face. The first shot discharged harmlessly into the ceiling. Emma vaulted around the counter before Adrian could recover. She seized Sophie with one arm, pulling the terrified child against her chest while shouting for Maria to get down. Glass shattered as another bullet tore through the front display. Emma pushed Sophie beneath the heavy wooden service counter, crawling beside her while shielding the little girl with her own body. Sophie trembled violently, clutching Isabella so tightly that the doll's stitched arm nearly tore free. "Close your eyes," Emma whispered, struggling to keep her own voice steady. "Whatever happens, don't let go of me." Sophie buried her face against Emma's shoulder, trusting completely, without understanding why the bakery had suddenly become a battlefield. Adrian forced himself upright, despite blood running from the cut above his eyebrow. His training quickly overcame the pain. He stepped around the shattered display with frightening calm, realizing the child hiding beneath the counter was even more valuable than the bakery owner. If he captured Gabriel's daughter alongside Emma, Victor's victory would be complete. Adrian lowered himself, extending one arm beneath the counter while raising the pistol with the other. Emma searched desperately for anything within reach. Broken glass covered the floor, flour drifted through the air like white smoke, and the smell of fresh bread had been replaced by gunpowder. She reached blindly for a heavy mixing bowl, ready to fight with whatever remained. Her only thought was simple and absolute. No one would touch the frightened child hiding behind her. The bakery door exploded inward before Adrian's hand reached them. Leo Romano burst through first, moving with terrifying speed, his pistol already drawn. Years protecting the Moretti family had trained every instinct inside him toward one purpose. He fired once, forcing Adrian backward behind an overturned table. Almost simultaneously, Gabriel Moretti entered through the broken doorway behind Leo. Rain soaked his black overcoat, his expression stripped of every trace of restraint. The calm businessman Emma argued with over the telephone no longer existed. In his place stood the man rivals whispered about in frightened voices. Moretti guards flooded the bakery from every direction, while gunfire erupted in deafening bursts. Shelves splintered, windows shattered outward into the street, and flour filled the room like pale winter fog. Adrian attempted to retreat through the kitchen entrance, but Leo intercepted him before he reached the rear exit. After less than a minute that felt endless, the shooting stopped. Victor's surviving men surrendered, and Adrian, wounded but alive, was forced to the ground in handcuffs. Silence returned gradually, broken only by Sophie sobbing beneath the counter. Gabriel dropped to his knees without hesitation and gathered his daughter into his arms. Sophie buried her face against his chest, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Gabriel held her with desperate strength, his eyes closing briefly, as if reassuring himself she was real, warm, and alive. Only after Sophie whispered, "Daddy," did he finally release the breath he had been holding since Leo's phone call. Maria stood nearby with tears streaming silently down her face, thanking God under her breath. Leo quietly ordered medics inside while keeping watch over the captured assassin. Then Gabriel turned toward Emma. She was still kneeling on the shattered floor beside the counter, breathing unevenly. Only then did Gabriel notice the trail of blood running from her right hand. During the struggle, she had driven her palm across broken glass while pulling Sophie to safety. Crimson drops stained the white flour scattered across the floor, creating painful splashes of red against the bakery tiles. Gabriel crossed the distance in 2 hurried steps before stopping abruptly. His hands that had signed billion-dollar agreements without hesitation and issued life-or-death commands with absolute certainty, suddenly trembled. He reached toward Emma, but seemed almost afraid to touch her, as though one careless movement might somehow worsen the injury she had accepted to save his daughter. Emma looked up at him through strands of flour-covered hair, her face pale from blood loss, yet illuminated by the same stubborn smile that had first appeared on the rainy night outside the bus stop. "This time," she whispered softly, meeting his shaken grey eyes with surprising warmth despite everything that had happened. "You weren't too late." 3 weeks after the attack, Brooks Bakery reopened beneath a clear winter sky, though the scars of violence had not disappeared completely. The shattered windows had been replaced, the damaged counter rebuilt, and the bullet marks hidden beneath fresh paint. Yet Emma still remembered where each piece of glass had fallen. Her injured hand had healed enough to knead dough again, though a thin pink line remained across her palm as a permanent reminder of the moment she had pulled Sophie beneath the counter. Customers returned cautiously at first, then in greater numbers after word spread that the bakery owner had protected a child during an armed attack. Emma disliked the attention and refused every reporter who tried to turn her into a spectacle. She had not acted because she wanted praise. She had acted because a frightened 6-year-old had been behind her, and there had been no other choice she could live with. Gabriel respected her refusal to speak publicly, but he refused to let the truth remain hidden. At a private gathering held inside the restored bakery, he stood before employees, neighbors, local business owners, and several representatives from the Moretti companies. He wore a dark charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his black hair neatly combed back, and his trimmed beard framing a face that had regained its usual control. Only Emma, standing beside Maria and Sophie, noticed how often his grey eyes returned to the fading scar on her hand. Gabriel had faced rivals, investigators, and powerful men without visible emotion. Yet speaking about Emma seemed to demand a different kind of courage. He did not describe her as a victim or a woman rescued by the Moretti family. Instead, He told everyone that Emma Brooks had entered their lives through an act of kindness no one had ordered, purchased, or expected. "She did not save one person," Gabriel said, his voice carrying through the bakery with quiet force. "She saved 3 generations of my family. She helped my mother when no one else stopped. She protected my daughter when danger entered this room. And in doing so, she reminded me that a family cannot survive on protection alone. It also needs warmth, honesty, and someone willing to turn back when everyone else keeps walking." Emma lowered her eyes because the emotion rising inside her felt too large to hide. Maria took her uninjured hand, while Sophie leaned against her side with the natural trust of a child who no longer questioned whether Emma would be there. Gabriel then announced that Brooks Bakery would not remain a single struggling shop. A new legal company had been created in Emma's name, with her controlling the brand, recipes, hiring standards, and daily operations. The first location would remain exactly where it was, while additional bakeries would open gradually across New York. Gabriel made it clear that this was not a gift Emma would be expected to repay. It was an investment built around her work, her judgment, and the dignity with which she had protected everything entrusted to her. Emma immediately objected that she had never asked to run a chain, but Gabriel calmly replied that she had already been running one impossible bakery with failing equipment, no staff, and almost no money. Compared with that, several properly funded locations would be easier. The new company grew carefully rather than extravagantly. Emma insisted that every bakery feel warm, affordable, and welcoming to people who might never enter luxury shops. She hired older workers who had been rejected elsewhere because of age, women rebuilding their lives after financial hardship, and young employees who needed flexible hours to continue school. She refused marble counters and unnecessary decoration, choosing sturdy wooden tables, open shelves, and kitchens visible from the customer area. Each location served the cinnamon bread Sophie loved, and Maria's orange marmalade pastries, created from the same fruit connected to the rainy night that began everything. Emma named the product line 3 Generations, though she refused to place her own face on the packaging. Every dollar of profit from that line was directed into a new charitable organization Gabriel established under Maria's name. The Maria Foundation began in a modest office above the original bakery. Its purpose was simple and practical. It delivered weekly meals to elderly people living alone, provided emergency grants and job training for women facing financial hardship, and supplied food, winter clothing, and school materials to children from poor neighborhoods. Maria became its most enthusiastic volunteer. At 70, she still refused to behave like someone who should sit quietly while others worked. She arrived at the bakery twice a week, wearing an apron over elegant dresses, complained that the mixers were too loud, and gave instructions to employees who had never officially reported to her. Emma taught her to shape bread rolls, though Maria's first attempts were uneven enough to make Sophie laugh until she cried. In return, Maria taught Emma the family recipes Isabella had once prepared, preserving memories without allowing grief to turn them into something untouchable. Gabriel visited more often than he intended. At first, he claimed he was reviewing security or discussing company finances. Soon, no one believed him, least of all Emma. He began arriving before closing, removing his expensive coat, and sitting at the corner table while Sophie completed schoolwork. Sometimes he answered calls while Emma baked. Sometimes he remained silent, watching the ordinary rhythm of the room with an expression that softened whenever Emma laughed. The bakery became the only place where Gabriel did not seem to carry the full weight of the Moretti name. Emma still argued with him when he made decisions without consulting her, and he still believed too strongly in solving problems before anyone admitted they existed. Yet their arguments no longer ended in slammed phones. They ended with coffee, compromise, and the growing certainty that neither wanted to return to life before the other entered it. The first time Sophie called her Mama Emma, the words came so naturally that no one understood their meaning until the room had gone quiet. Sophie had been sitting on the kitchen counter, helping decorate small cakes for a foundation event. When frosting spilled onto her sleeve, She reached toward Emma and said, "Mama Emma, can you fix it?" Emma froze with a cloth in her hand. Sophie's expression changed immediately, as though she feared she had done something wrong. Gabriel stood near the doorway, unable to speak, while Maria pressed one hand over her mouth. Emma knelt before Sophie and explained gently that no one could replace the mother she had lost. Sophie nodded and said she knew. Then she wrapped both arms around Emma's neck and whispered that she did not want a replacement. She only wanted another mother who had chosen to stay. A year passed from the night Emma first saw Maria and Sophie struggling in the rain. The original bakery had become the heart of a growing network, but Emma still opened it herself each morning, whenever her schedule allowed. On the anniversary, Gabriel asked her to meet him there after closing. Snow had begun to fall lightly over the street, dusting the awning and softening the city noise. Emma arrived wearing the same grey scarf she had once wrapped around Sophie, carefully repaired and returned to her months earlier. Maria waited beside the doorway, smiling with suspicious innocence, while Sophie stood in a red winter coat, holding a small box against her chest. Leo remained discreetly across the street, though even he could not hide the rare warmth in his scarred face. Gabriel stepped forward beneath the bakery lights. He wore a black wool coat, but his usual authority seemed stripped away, leaving only a man who had spent 3 years believing love was something that could vanish without warning. Emma saw the tension in his jaw and the unfamiliar uncertainty in his eyes. Before she could ask what was happening, Gabriel lowered himself onto one knee. Sophie handed him the box, and he opened it to reveal a simple diamond ring set in white gold. It was elegant without being excessive, chosen for the woman Emma was, rather than the wealth Gabriel possessed. His hands did not shake as they had when he first saw her bleeding, but his voice carried the same unguarded emotion. "The night you helped my mother and daughter in the rain, you believed you were only carrying 2 bags of groceries home," he said. "But the truth is, you carried my entire family home." Emma's breath broke into a sob before she could answer. She looked at Maria, whose eyes were bright with tears, then at Sophie, who was already bouncing with impatience. Gabriel remained on one knee, waiting without command, pressure, or certainty. For once, the most powerful man in New York offered no protection plan and no solution. He simply trusted Emma with the answer. She nodded through tears and whispered yes. Sophie rushed forward before Gabriel could place the ring on Emma's finger, throwing herself around both of them with enough force to nearly knock him sideways. Maria joined them a moment later, laughing and crying as the 4 stood together beneath the warm light of the bakery window. Snow continued to fall around 3 generations of the Moretti family, gathered outside Brooks' Bakery. Behind them, ovens glowed, bread cooled on wooden racks, and the first shop remained exactly where one exhausted woman had once returned from a bus stop because she could not bear to leave an old woman and a child alone in the rain. Emma had believed that kindness cost her only a missed bus, a wet scarf, and a long walk home. Instead, that small decision changed the fate of a grieving father, a lonely child, a stubborn grandmother, and a woman who had nearly lost faith in her own future. The Moretti family had once been held together by fear of losing one another. Now they stood together because one woman had chosen to turn back. Sometimes, God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, bright lights, or signs from heaven. Sometimes, they begin with an exhausted woman turning back in the rain because she cannot ignore an elderly lady and a frightened child. Emma believed she was only carrying 2 broken grocery bags, but God was quietly leading her toward the family, purpose, and love she had been praying for without even realizing it. In our daily lives, we often think a small act of kindness is too ordinary to matter. A warm meal, a helping hand, a gentle word, or simply stopping when everyone else walks away may seem insignificant. But in God's hands, even the smallest kindness can become the beginning of a miracle. We may never know whose heart we are healing, whose faith we are restoring, or how one compassionate decision might change several lives forever. So when life gives you the chance to help someone, do not underestimate that moment. You may believe you are only carrying someone's burden for a few steps, while God may be using you to lead an entire family home. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in kindness and second chances. Tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your life? Please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring stories. May God bless you, protect your family, and return every kindness in your heart 100-fold.